afternoon, everyone. I am very glad to participate in the 7th Annual Conference Heart Failure Association of India, and I wish advance congratulations for a grand success to the organizers for this conference. Personally, thanks to Dr. Abraham Human. Now, we have very important topic today to begin with, in that what is happening exactly around the globe after this COVID-19 chaos. So to talk upon that, we have three speakers. I would like to just mention the topics and the speaker's name accordingly. We start with Dr. Babu Abraham. He is going to deliver the lecture on if COVID-19 changes a critical care in 2020. What are the lessons learned and beyond? And then COVID-19 in the end is an endothelial disorder, that is by Dr. Santosh Satish. And then myocardial injury due to COVID-19 to be delivered by Dr. N. Sendilkumar. So with this, I would like to invite Dr. Babu Abraham to deliver his lecture.
COVID-19 changed critical care in 2020. Lessons learned and beyond. I am Dr. Babu Abraham. I would like to thank the organizers for having invited me to give this talk. Over the next 12 minutes, I would be taking you through 12 slides, and I will be covering what is the present situation of COVID-19 in India, changes that have happened to critical care in 2020, and just one slide on what are the lessons we have learned from this 10 to 11 months of this pandemic. Okay, all of us know that the first case of COVID-19 was reported in Wuhan, China in late 2019. The first case in India was reported 30th of January 2020 by a medical student who returned from Wuhan. WHO declared the pandemic in March 2020, and India went into complete lockdown on 25th of March till 31st of May. About 40% of the COVID-19 patients are asymptomatic, and of the symptomatic patients, only 90% do not even need hospitalization. Only about 7% come to the hospital, and out of that only 5% require ICU. The case related fatality is about 2.5 to 5% as per the studies quoted. So it's not that severe a disease, and the mortality rate is not too high. What's the present situation in India? As of 11th of February 2020, we had about 1,871,301 confirmed COVID cases. At the moment, we have 1,39,564 active cases. More than 1,571,747 cases have recovered, and the death rate is only 1,55,399. At the start of the pandemic, experts in the Western world predicted that India is going to be the country that is going to be worst hit with the highest mortality. Over the last 10 to 11 months, we have proved them wrong. What was the state of India before the start of COVID-19? We had very few ICU beds. The number of ICU beds were only 2.3 per 100,000 population, much less than Mongolia and Nepal. The number of beds with oxygen supply was only 120,000. Those with ventilators was only 50,000. We do not know the number of trained ICU doctors we have. The Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine has 12,000 registered members. So we think we have about 12,000 ICU trained doctors. We have no idea how many ICU trained nurses we have. Another study also shows the same thing. We have about 100,000 ICU beds, and about 50,000 ventilators. And it's with that we entered into the pandemic. What was surprising is this study showed that the highest number of hospitals with ventilators are in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India. My state, Tamil Nadu, has only about 8%. Now, what did we do over the last 10 to 11 months? How did we get through this pandemic? The shortage of ICU beds were covered by converting a lot of other hospital beds into ICU beds. We took beds from operation rooms, from recovery rooms. Large wards were converted into ICUs. We were innovative because we could not get negative pressure rooms. We put in HME filters. We had exhaust fans put in, had large rooms with good cross ventilations, all turned into ICU. We moved personnel from every ward into the ICU. We had orthopedic surgeons, plastic surgeons working with us in the ICU, nurses from everywhere. There were crash courses for training these doctors and nurses to become critical care personnel. Equipments, we had our own manufacturers coming in, helping us with manufacturing of PPE, ventilators, oxygen delivery devices like HFNC. Our hospitals that did not have oxygen therapy devices had liquid oxygen put into them, and very quickly we were able to expand our services down to the district levels. What was most interesting is during the lockdown and pandemic, where patient and the families get separated, the communication and teamwork was maintained by the use of technology. Video conferencing was used for communicating with families. Nurses used video conferencing to communicate with doctors who had moved out of the ICU and are not having the PPE, to show them a patient's condition, the monitors, the ventilator setting, and this worked perfectly well. Prioritization of ICU care was a big problem for us. We had shortages of beds and manpower. First come, first served policy was used, so there was a lot of unhappiness with patients waiting in the emergency room, in ambulance waiting a bed. We did not have any streamlined ICU admission policies, even though guidelines were available. We do not have policies that help us make decisions to stop or limit care. That also added to the burden. The ability to track available ICU beds were not initially available, but the government of Tamil Nadu set it up in about 2 months into the pandemic, and we had live streaming apps which could tell the ambulance crew which is a hospital where an empty ICU bed was available. How did we progress with the management? There was extreme pressure on most of the doctors to identify effective treatment. Progress was hampered mainly by media hype, political and celebratory interference, and high demand for therapy from patient and family. So the initial treatment was haphazard. Studies published during the early period was not rigorously reviewed. However, with time, we made progress, and there's been understanding of the pathogenesis, and the management has improved. Studies like Recovery, Solidarity, and REMAP-CAP has shown that the initial decisions that we had taken were not perfect, and it also showed that India as a country could be part of large RCT trials. This also showed us that personalized care was extremely essential. Even though COVID-19 is a viral infection, every patient was different. The respiratory failure was multifaceted. The ARDS was different, and treatment had to be individualized. The initial mistakes we did, where we gave too much of high flow FiO2, allowed the patient to breathe too fast for too long, used very high PEEP, used diuretic and restricted fluid. The cytokine storm, which we thought was a storm, turned out actually not to be a storm, but we did come out of all that. The most important change that this brought in is the expenditure on healthcare, which is only 3.5% of the Indian GDP till 2018, all of a sudden increased, and at this budget there was a 137% increase in healthcare, which is very welcome. So what would we learn over this last 10 to 11 months? That we need more ICU beds, and maybe we should make more ICU beds in our hospital ICU ready. We need more trained personnel, doctors, nurses, RTs, physiotherapists, clinical pharmacists and nutritionists. We need to be well equipped, and our own manufacturing unit can do that for us. We need to promote tele ICU for rural India, which will make treatment of sick patients better. We need a permanent centralized method of finding out where we have vacant ICU beds. We need help from the executive and judiciary for formulating policies which will help us with ICU admissions, limitation of life support, so that we can make valuable ICU beds available for appropriate patients. We need medical body like the ICMR to oversee and regulate therapy and research during pandemics and not allow haphazard treatment. We need to get involved with global RCTs so that we know how treatment is progressing, and we need to campaign for more healthcare funding. I would stop my talk with this words of Professor Winston in the recent publication. Learn to accept that under demanding conditions and with limited resources, it is not possible for practical to offer the quality of care that we would wish and are used to providing. This is very difficult to accept psychologically, but is the only way to manage increasing patient numbers. Thank you very much.
Good evening, all of you. Today, in this session on COVID and heart failure, I'll be talking on this topic, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. We look at this particular aspect of COVID. In the end, it is an endothelial disease. So, before we proceed with the presentation, I would like to say two abbreviations that we commonly use. COVID-19 means it is coronavirus disease 2019. The whole spectrum of clinical spectrum, the whole disease is called COVID-19, and the disease is caused by SARS-CoV-2, that is the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. This is different from, there is another SARS-CoV. So that is that came many years back. So to differentiate from that SARS, this SARS is called CoV-2. So with this brief clarification, I will start. So this is the electron microscopic reconstruction of the coronavirus, which most of us are aware is causing the pandemic, and different depictions have come, but this is most true to life how the virus looks, how it actually looks at the electron microscopic scale. You can see a lot of projections. To explain it a little bit better, I'll show you the schematic diagram. You can see that it has got large proteins which actually project from the surface of the virus, and this is called the S protein or the spike protein. And then we have the membrane, and inside you have E protein, M protein and N protein, and these are the proteins which are there associated with the membrane as well as the inner parts of the virus, and you have the viral RNA. So this virus does not contain DNA, this virus contains only RNA. So what is important to notice, only the internal structures will get injected into a cell which gets infected with this virus, whereas the surface protein, the S protein or spike, which is colored in orange, that doesn't go inside the cell. So in the next 10 minutes or 11 minutes, I go through this is the agenda. How does the COVID virus enter the body, and what's the most common mechanism of death in COVID? What happens to the endothelium in lung, heart and other tissues, and why endothelium is important in this pathophysiology? And is the involvement of endothelium a secondary effect to systemic inflammation? Because a lot of diseases causes systemic effects and that can indirectly affect endothelium. In what way does the endothelial involvement affect the lung and other organs? And therapies targeted at restoration of endothelial function, are they useful? So this is the original SARS-CoV coronavirus, which came in 2002 and which spread across South Asia, many countries, and around 8,000 cases were there, 774 deaths, and 26 countries were affected. And what is important to note is, it was noted in 2003 itself that the SARS coronavirus of 2002, the target, where does it get attached to? That is a angiotensin converting enzyme to ACE2, which is available on the surface of some cells. That's a target. And this target alone is not enough. You need to have a protease, transmembrane protease serine, that is TMPRSS2. This is another agent which is also present on the cell membrane, which actually will help this virus to get into the cell. It first gets stuck to the ACE, which is the receptor for the virus, and then after that the TMPRSS2 is what helps the virus to get into the cell, and after that this gets neutralized. So when this coronavirus came in 2019 December, within 2 months researchers found out that this coronavirus also, the coronavirus 2 also, the receptor is ACE inhibitor, ACE angiotensin converting enzyme and 2, and the same spike protein priming agent, that protease enzyme helps in getting into that, and the neutralization efficiency by SARS convalescent sera is also possible. So first step is, there are primary targets of this coronavirus. Even though it enters through the nose and goes into the lungs, it actually gets infected. The infectious process starts propagating from the lung. So this is a alveolar cell, and it is in the alveolar cell surface you have the ACE and you have the protease, which actually helps this, the orange part is the virus spike, and this protease will digest the tip of the spike and it will get stuck inside, and that gets internalized into the cell membrane inside the cell. So this is what happens after the internalization. The virus RNA and the other proteins will go inside, and it will take over the control of the protein synthesis inside the host cell. So in this particular instance, the cell is the lung cell, and then it orders the cell to produce copies of the virus, and finally the virus gets ejected into the respiratory mucosa as well as into the blood vessels, multiple copies of this, and finally the cell can die. So this is how the pathogenesis happens. So what are causes of death in COVID-19? We all know that means around 30% of the people are asymptomatic, and remaining 35 to 40% of the people have mild symptoms, and only 2% of the people die most of the places. That is 2% people mean overall. The most common cause of death in COVID patients are the diffuse alveolar damage, which causes lung destruction and disseminated intravascular coagulation. 91.3% of the dead patients had microthrombi in multiple tissues, and the levels of D-dimer is a prognostic adverse. The higher the levels, it's a worse prognosis. And what happens is you have microvascular thrombosis, microcirculation failure, multi-organ dysfunction, and finally death. And it has also been noticed in many series, registries and studies that high incidence of pulmonary embolism and sudden cardiac death in the absence of overt deep venous thrombosis and coronary artery disease. So, what is the evidence of coronary COVID-19 being an endothelial disease? Well, I said that it affects the pulmonary cells. So, if you look at the risk factors for death due to COVID-19, these are the subsets of people who are at the highest risk of death because of COVID. Older people, that is, as age increases, the risk also increases. Smokers, hypertensives, diabetics, people who are having obesity, chronic kidney disease, and coronary disease. Now, these are the same risk factors for endothelial dysfunction. So, you see endothelial dysfunction itself, whatever causes endothelial dysfunction causes increased risk of death in COVID patients. Now, what are the primary targets of SARS-CoV? The cells with abundant surface ACE to angiogen converting enzyme. These are the pneumocytes of the pulmonary alveoli, enterocytes of small intestine, and endothelial cells. So, these are the three primary targets of SARS coronavirus 2. Please understand that ACE is present in many tissues across the body. So this is just a spectrum of the tissues starting from the nasal, even the eye, corneal tissue also contains it always, all the way it goes to the brain and placenta. But please understand that we need to focus on, we need to have the ACE as well as the protease for the virus to get into the cell. So, when you look at the evidence, there are three major studies which showed autopsy evidence of endothelial dysfunction and thrombosis in patients with COVID-19. So, this is one study in which they compared COVID-19 6 patients, H1N1 10 patients, and control group patients 11 cases. All these patients had respiratory distress and they were treated in an ICU and the patient died. All of them had lung involvement. And the hypothesis was that if the patients who had lung damage, pneumonia, inflammatory pneumonia and other reasons, if they had multi-system involvement and multi-organ failure, then all the findings in the lung and endothelium and everything will be secondary changes. So to avoid that confusion, they added this H1N1 cases on the control group. So it was very surprising. They compared this COVID-19 H1N1 and control, and then they did immunohistochemistry of the tissue from the lung, and then they found out that endothelial the cells TNF alpha, interleukin 6, ICAM1 in percentage and caspase in tissue expression, all of them had very high levels in COVID, but not in the other two. You can just see the graph. You can see that the COVID, it's much higher. All parameters are much higher in COVID compared to others. That means it is not because of a systemic inflammation, all these things happening. There is a direct effect of the virus happening in this endothelial dysfunction is caused by some direct effect of the virus, not because of the secondary effects of the systemic inflammatory reaction. Another article published in NEJM, that also in July 2020, they compared 7 patients with COVID-19 and 7 patients with influenza and 10 control patients without any infection, and then they found this was electron microscopic evaluation. Previous one was immunohistochemistry. They found severe endothelial injury, intracellular virus was present, and alveolar capillary microthrombi was seen. And in addition, the most important point was there was intussusceptive angiogenesis, very peculiar to find in this particular condition. And this is the example. You can see microthrombi and lymphocytic pneumonia, and you can see there is intussusceptive angiogenesis was present in only in the COVID-19 lungs. And another study, this also post-mortem, they analyzed 6 COVID-19 patients. They analyzed the coronary tree starting from the main coronary arteries till the capillaries, and they found that inflammatory neuropathy and small vessel vasculitis not involving the main coronary arteries. So you can understand that there is endotheliitis of the heart. So this is a epicardial nerve, venule, and the capillary, showing inflammation and microthrombi. To summarize, these are the effects on endothelium. Dysfunction of venules, capillaries and arterioles, not arteries, infection of the endothelium, inflammation causing endothelitis, destruction of the endothelium because of pyroptosis, small vessel vasculitis in the heart, and angiogenesis, which is intussusceptive. So there are a lot of therapeutic targets of COVID-19 endotheliopathy. Glucocorticoids, heparin, antiplaces we already know. Colchicine and anakinra and canakinumab, all these three agents have shown promising results, and the larger multi-center trials are underway. So the take-home messages are severe COVID-19 affects the endothelium of small vessels of lungs and heart predominantly. COVID endotheliopathy more when there is prior endothelial dysfunction. This endotheliopathy includes dysfunction, inflammation, infection, death, angiogenesis, and thrombosis. Major mechanism of lung damage and multi-organ failure, which leads to death. Targets for anticoagulant, anti-inflammatory, and endothelial rejuvenating therapies are promising. Thank you.
Respected chairpersons, respected senior members, and my dear friends. Associations have released a guidance document from various aspects of cardiovascular care during this COVID-19 pandemic. This document is not a guideline recommendation. Friends, what is the difference between a guideline recommendation and a guideline document? The document is the result of observations and personal experience from the various healthcare providers at the forefront of the COVID-19 pandemic. Current evidence related to SARS-CoV-2 and its disease manifestations are observational and not based on prospective design studies. This guidance document does not override the individual responsibility of the healthcare professional to provide appropriate decision, and the final decision concerning an individual patient must be made by the physician responsible on the ground level and can vary based on patient to patient. This guidance document should not interfere with the recommendations provided by the local and national healthcare authorities. Pandemic represents a moving target. Some aspects discussed in this document may not only apply to the regions most heavily affected by COVID-19, and other criteria may apply to the less affected geographical areas. It provides only a snapshot with the preliminary information that may change and mature over time with increasing evidence from a prospective study. Since our understanding in this subject is only evolving at this stage, the information contained in this talk is based on the available data on COVID-19. Having seen what is a guideline document and the recommendation, let us go to what are all the cardiovascular diseases in COVID-19. It can range from acute coronary syndrome, heart failure, myocarditis, arrhythmias, hypertension in COVID, hypercoagulable state, venous thromboembolism, pericardial effusion. What are the pathophysiological mechanism involved in the cardiovascular disease in COVID-19? It ranges from direct effects from indirect effects, ranging from direct cardiotoxicity, dysregulation of the RAS, endothelial damage and thromboinflammation, immune dysregulation, demand-supply mismatch causing acute cardiac injury, acute myocardial infarction, myocarditis, arrhythmia, heart failure, pulmonary embolism, and shock. What are the potential mechanism of this acute myocardial injury in COVID-19? The cardiac phenotypes and mechanisms like hypotension, hypoxia, AC2-mediated cytokine storm, adrenergic stimulation, coagulopathy causing acute myocardial infarction, viral myocarditis, coronary microvascular ischemia, stress cardiomyopathy, and tachyarrhythmias. So having spent 1.5 minutes about the generalized cardiovascular manifestation in COVID-19, let us go to the crux of my topic, that is heart failure. Heart failure is one of the commonest symptomatic cardiac manifestation in COVID-19. What are the various presentations with which patients can present? It can occur in a patient with pre-existing cardiac problem or patient without any pre-existing cardiac problem. A false picture of a cardiac disease without a real cardiac involvement. Having seen the collision between the acute COVID-19 pandemic and the underlying heart failure epidemic, let us go to the incidence of the COVID myocarditis. It remains unclear as on date because of the early reports lacked specific diagnostic modalities. As on date, I underline the statement, as on date it is around 15%. It may be overestimated or it can be underestimated at this point of time. What is the pathophysiology of COVID-19 related myocardial injury, that is myocarditis? COVID-related myocarditis is an inflammatory disease of the heart characterized by inflammatory infiltrates and myocardial injury without an ischemic cause. It can be due to direct cell injury or T lymphocyte mediated cytotoxicity or interleukin 6 related cytokine storm and cytokine storm syndrome causing is the final destination of this event. Myocarditis, the autopsies of the patients with COVID-19 infection reveal infiltration of myocardium with interstitial mononuclear inflammatory cells. Myocardial injury may be due to infection-induced myocarditis, ischemia, respiratory failure with hypoxia, upregulation of ACE2 immune mechanism, and release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. The gross findings of lung and heart is showed in this picture. A heart showing extreme right ventricular dilatation with straightening of interventricular septum, and the cut section of the lung showing thrombi present within the peripheral small vessel disease. Pathophysiology and phenotype-based diagnostic modalities to detect cardiac injury in COVID-19 is depicted in this slide. The ACE2-mediated direct damage, hypoxia-induced myocardial injury, cardiac microvascular disease, and systemic inflammatory response syndrome causes acute cardiac injury, which is reflected as elevated cardiac biomarkers, electrical abnormalities in ECG, echocardiographic abnormalities in ECG, findings in CT coronary angiogram or conventional coronary angiogram, or findings in cardiac MRI or rarely endomyocardial biopsy. Having seen this pathophysiology, how do you incorporate this pathophysiology to derive the diagnosis of the myocardial injury, which was depicted in this article? Definition of cardiac injury is one of the following: cardiac biomarker, which is reflected as elevated troponin and CKMB, new ECG abnormalities ranging from SVT, VT, VF, atrial fibrillation, bundle branch block, STT changes, QT prolongation, and new echocardiographic LV dysfunction or worsening of pre-existing LV dysfunction in the echocardiogram. Webinar by Professor Yin Chio Kim defined cardiac injury as sign of myocardial damage, which is increased CKMB or troponin, sign of heart failure, which is increased NT-proBNP, and sign of electrical abnormality like abnormal ECG, as I told in the previous slide. Naturally, the higher level of cardiac injury is related with the lower survival rate. In the same webinar, he had highlighted about the symptoms which is experienced by the patients ranging from chest pain, dyspnea, and non-cardiac symptoms like extreme fatigability. The first case of COVID-19 infection with fulminant myocarditis complication is as follows. 63-year-old hypertensive presented with fever, dyspnea, and chest pain. That patient revealed ECG changes, as I told you, cardiac enzyme elevation, and documented LV dysfunction in echo. On the other hand, there are patients with no cardiac symptoms presenting with undue fatigability and extreme tiredness, which with ECG changes, elevated cardiac enzymes, and LV dysfunction in echo. Other investigations like elevated LDH, ST, ESR, procalcitonin are raised irrespective of myocardial injury. It is critical to distinguish fulminant myocarditis from sepsis for fluid management at that point of time, which can be done by echocardiogram. Echocardiographic findings in COVID myocarditis are increased wall thickness, chamber dilatation, mild pericardial effusion with significant ventricular systolic dysfunction. The MRI findings in a patient with COVID myocarditis are edema, irreversible cell injury, hyperemia, or capillary leak. So these are all the MRI findings revealing the hyperemia and capillary leak in the MRI picture of a patient with myocarditis. Although cardiac MRI offers major advantages over echo, it is limited because of the availability requirement of breath holding and contagiousness of this COVID disease. Coming to the most loudly and frequently discussed topic, having seen the diagnostic modality, we will go to the therapeutic aspect. So the loudly discussed AC inhibitor and ARB in COVID-19. Questions should be answered are: what is ACE2 enzyme receptor? How does AC inhibitor and ARB influence the COVID infection? Can we continue AC inhibitor or ARB in a COVID patient? ACE2 enzyme receptor present in heart, lungs, and kidney. SARS-CoV-2 enters through the ACE2 receptor lung to pneumocytes, which causes endocytosis of the ACE2 receptor, and there is a down regulation of ACE2 levels and unopposed angiotensin 2, which causes an acute lung injury, vasoconstriction, and subsequently vascular leak. So what happens if the patient is on AC inhibitor? Naturally, if the patient is on AC inhibitor, the AC inhibitor inhibits, and there is a decrease in the angiotensin 2 levels, and there is an increase in the ACE2 levels, which causes a breakdown in angiotensin 2 and controls the blood pressure and blocks the organ damage. The early controversy is that the AC inhibitor and ARB patients can cause compensatory increase in the tissue levels of the ACT, which was subsequently proven wrong. And what does the data show? There was a study of more than 1,000 patients who are receiving AC inhibitor on one hand or ARB on other hand, they were not on AC inhibitor. The observations were All-cause mortality was lower in patients receiving AC inhibitor or ARB, and the lower risk of COVID-19 mortality in patients who received AC inhibitor or ARB. So, which concluded that all recommendations of various societies, it may be CSI, it may be European Society of Hypertension, it may be ACC, all concluded that patients on AC inhibitor and ARB should be continued in COVID patients. Withdrawal of these AC inhibitor or ARB could result in more harm than benefits, especially in high risk patients. Prophylactic use of AC inhibitor and ARB is questionable at this point of time. So long-term sequelae chronic complication, while acute myocardial injury is current focus, the long-term effects are unknown. If a patient presents after the COVID illness, even if it is more than 60 days or 90 days with undue fatigability, make sure that you do a detailed echocardiographic examination to rule out diastolic dysfunction, global longitudinal strain to assess the systolic function, E bar E prime for filling pressures. If there is accessibility and availability of a cardiac MRI should be done. The latest study in November 2020 revealed 60% of patients after COVID recovery at the end of 90 days had 60% cardiac findings in cardiac MRI, independent, I underline the statement, independent of the pre-existing condition and severity and overall course of the COVID illness. So independent of the course of the COVID illness, patient had long-term cardiovascular consequences of COVID-19. So the take-home message from this 12-minute talk is safety of medical team paramount, pre-existing heart failure and cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension and DM worsens the prognosis. AC inhibitor or ARB should be continued in COVID patients if there are no absolute contraindications. Myocardial injury present in at least 1 in 5 patients. Myocardial injury worsens in hospital prognosis and has high risk for death. Cardiac involvement include MI, heart failure, shock, fulminant myocarditis, arrhythmias. Cardiac injury can present without respiratory symptom or fever. COVID should be a part of differential diagnosis. Multiple mechanisms are postulated, drug interactions to be kept in mind. Post-COVID recovery, you have to keep cardiovascular sequelae in mind. Thank you for the patient listening.
Sir, we now have 5 minutes for discussion, sir.
Yeah, any of the speakers can answer me. If we think that COVID is going to affect the endothelium, the patients who present with myocarditis or myocardial infarction, they should have concurrent pulmonary involvement, which we don't see. That patient having ischemic manifestation or heart failure manifestation, but there don't be any associated pulmonary involvement in these patients. How do you justify that? Any of the speakers can take my question.
What I understand your question is, if a patient is coming with isolated cardiac involvement without
not isolated, because many people went on publishing that the incidence of myocardial infarction and acute coronary syndrome has gone up during COVID time. But truly speaking, I didn't observe in such a very busy hospital. Many of my colleagues also concur with my opinion. So if really COVID is going to precipitate acute events, coronary events, ACS, it should have associated pulmonary events also. Like patient should have some amount of pulmonary fibrosis or respiratory. Patient should have the CT evidence of severe involvement of the lungs.
As we know, sir, the amount of involvement of the different tissues in a COVID patient, it is a wide spectrum. And if you, as all of us know, means at least 30% of the people are totally asymptomatic. I may have COVID, I may be sitting and talking to you. No symptoms, no fever, nothing. Whereas on the other extreme, somebody of my age may be in a ventilator, fighting for his life. So this particular spectrum is because they are having COVID virus is there inside their body, and people who have risk factors. Because the thing is, somebody has got hypertension, diabetes, obesity, who gets COVID. Not all of them become very sick. We have seen a lot of patients who are having hypertension, who are having coronary disease, who become COVID positive and they go home without any problem. They don't even become symptomatic. So these are the there is a huge variation, genetic variation between there is.
Babu, do you think really the incidence of acute coronary syndromes has gone up during COVID?
I am not sure, sir, because in what I am seeing in my OP as a pulmonologist is we do get people with chronic lung problem, ILD, which over the last I'll say 3 to 4 months, which I've been following up, slowly improving. None of them have got heart failure for sure, because the two to three things that I check every 3 months on them are the echo, PFT, and 6-minute walk test, and I see them slowly improving. So at least those who come with damaged post-COVID lung sequel do not seem to have a predominant cardiac involvement.
Dr. Ilayaraja would like to take.
Yes, sir. So I am in line with you. Some of the observations you made it already, but then I would like to redefine the same question in your direction. That when you look at the mortality is very high in patients with the comorbidity versus the mortality in patients without comorbidity is very, very less, say less than 1%. So we need to look at why there is high mortality in patients with the comorbidity. So whether just they are not able to withstand the so-called pulmonary disease, because that is the commonest mode of say the diffuse cellular damage is the commonest cause of death in the COVID patients, or say what is the share of cardiovascular mortality, because basically it's endothelial disease, as Satish pointed out. So what is the share of cardiovascular disease mortality in that versus the so-called life-saving drugs, statins, beta blockers, ACR inhibitors? Pre-COVID era is different. We have a lot of evidence. But now, if you look at even the RAS system and then ACE2 degradation pathway, so every year we are getting that pathway is redefined, something like a Sindhupal story. It is really evolving. So though the guidelines suggest that we can still go with the ACE-ARB in COVID patients, that the entire picture is not clearly delineated. What I would like to convey is that it needs more evidence that during COVID era or post-COVID patients, CHF patients, what is the drug interactions, namely the statins or beta blockers, RAS, now with this COVID, it needs really more evidence to be followed. So what's your take on that? I think the time is out. I think is it really... Hello?
Is there any time now? Hello?
Sir, we are just out of time, sir.
Just out of time. Okay, fine. So I think all the speakers have well covered the topic, and it is quite interesting and educative. Thank you very much. I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Ilayaraja, and all the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.